On the 18th of June 1990, Cindy Barrett, 26 years old, was last seen alive near the wooden cabin she had rented inside the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee. 20 years later, her remains were discovered chained to a wooden post deep in the forest, about 3 miles from the main tourist trail. Her skull had been struck by a blunt object, and fragments of her personal belongings lay scattered beside her remains. Cindy had worked as a librarian at the Knoxville Central Library for 4 years. Colleagues described her as quiet, diligent, rarely late, and almost never absent from work. She lived alone in a small apartment on Sycamore Street, drove an old blue 1987 Honda Civic, and meticulously kept a diary, recording even the smallest events of her days. She had no close friends among her coworkers, but everyone spoke of her with respect. Cindy assisted visitors in finding books, organized children's events on weekends, and carefully cataloged every new arrival on the shelves. Yet her private life was more complicated. Until February 1990, Cindy had been living with her boyfriend Randall Kruger, a man 10 years older who worked as an electrician and construction repairman. Cindy Barrett's life, in many ways, was defined by simplicity and routine. She was not the type to draw attention to herself, nor did she ever seek the spotlight. Those who knew her best described her as steady, careful, and gentle, a young woman who found comfort in books more than in crowded social circles. At the Knoxville Central Library, where she had worked since graduating college, her quiet presence had become part of the building itself. Patrons would often recall her calm smile as she guided them through rows of shelves, always patient, always precise. Outside of work, Cindy's world was small but structured. Her modest apartment on Sycamore Street held little more than the basics: shelves lined with her favorite novels, a second-hand sofa, and her carefully kept journals stacked neatly in a corner. To her, writing was more than a hobby. It was a way of creating order in a life that sometimes felt unpredictable. She noted down daily events with the same care she gave to cataloging books at the library, documenting not only what happened, but also how it made her feel. These diaries, later studied by investigators, revealed a woman deeply observant and sensitive, someone who noticed the smallest details others might overlook. Friends and coworkers respected Cindy, though she rarely let anyone close enough to truly know her. She preferred the safety of boundaries, keeping her personal world tucked away. Yet beneath that reserved nature was someone who longed for stability, for a kind of love that felt safe. It was that longing which had once drawn her into the orbit of Randall Kruger, a man who at first appeared attentive and reliable. For a time, he gave her the companionship she had been searching for. But as months passed, Randall's behavior shifted from affectionate to controlling, from protective to possessive. Cindy, true to her quiet resilience, endured it longer than most would have. By early 1990, she finally found the courage to walk away. The breakup had not been easy, but Cindy believed it was a step toward reclaiming the peace she cherished. Those closest to her noticed subtle changes. She began spending more time outdoors, reconnecting with her love of nature, even taking short hikes in the Smoky Mountains on weekends. To Cindy, the forest offered something the city never could: a silence that felt like freedom and an escape from the shadows of her past. By June of 1990, Cindy was beginning to carve out a new rhythm for herself. The heavy shadow of her relationship with Randall was slowly lifting, though traces of unease still lingered. Friends would later recall how she spoke about wanting time alone, space to breathe and to think. It was this desire that led her to rent a small rustic cabin near Gatlinburg on the edge of the Great Smoky Mountains. To Cindy, it was not just a getaway, it was a chance to heal. The mountains had always been a place where she felt safe, where the whispers of the wind and the trees seemed to drown out the noise of everything else. In those last days, Cindy appeared quietly optimistic. She spent evenings reading on the porch of the cabin, jotting notes into her diary, and taking short walks along nearby trails. Earl Simmons, the elderly man who owned the property, would later recall seeing her on the cabin steps with a book in her lap, her expression calm but distant, as if she were sorting through her own thoughts. But Earl also remembered something unsettling. One afternoon, he noticed a gray pickup truck parked near the cabin and a man standing close to Cindy, gesturing angrily. Earl did not hear their words, but he saw Cindy's posture stiff, hesitant, and the man's movements sharp, aggressive. That man, investigators would later confirm, was Randall Kruger. On the evening of June 17, Cindy made a brief call to a coworker. She mentioned her plans to take a hike the next morning, saying she wanted to explore a section of the Old Settlers Trail. It was meant to be a quiet day for herself, a way to reconnect with nature. Her voice over the phone was steady, even cheerful. No one knew it would be the last time anyone would ever hear from her. The following morning, June 18, Cindy parked her aging blue Honda Civic near the trailhead. Other hikers later reported seeing a young woman who matched her description, wearing hiking boots and carrying a small pack. She exchanged polite greetings, but kept to herself, stepping quietly along the path that wound deeper into the woods. After that moment, she seemed to vanish into the green expanse of the Smokies. By late afternoon, when she did not return to her cabin, there was little immediate alarm. Cindy was known to spend long hours walking and reflecting. But as night fell, her car remained untouched at the trailhead, locked with her belongings still inside. The forest, vast and indifferent, had swallowed her whole. For those who had come to know the case, these final days became the focus of endless questions. Did Randall follow her into the woods that morning? Was their confrontation at the cabin a warning of what was to come? Or had Cindy simply wandered into danger by chance? The answers, at that time, lay buried in silence, hidden beneath the shadows of the Smoky Mountains. When Cindy Barrett was first reported missing, on the 18th of June, 1990, her friends and coworkers were stunned. Cindy was not the kind of person to simply vanish without leaving a trace. She had a routine, a grounded life, and people who cared for her deeply. As hours turned into a full day without contact, her family's concern grew into fear. The search began swiftly. Rangers from Great Smoky Mountains National Park organized ground teams, joined by local volunteers who knew the trails well. Helicopters hovered above the dense forest, scanning for any sign of movement, while search dogs were brought in to follow her scent. The area around the cabin where she was last seen became the focal point, but the woods were vast, unforgiving, and filled with hidden ravines that could swallow someone without a sound. Investigators retraced Cindy's last known steps. They learned she had spent the evening near the cabin, likely preparing for another day of work at the library. Nothing seemed unusual. No signs of struggle. No evidence of forced entry into the cabin. Her Honda Civic was parked nearby, locked, with her purse and a few personal items inside. It was as if she had stepped out for a short walk and never returned. The lack of clues baffled authorities. Interviews with her co-workers and friends painted a picture of a responsible, kind woman who had no known enemies. She was not involved in dangerous activities, nor did she struggle with mental health issues that might suggest she had chosen to disappear on her own. Every lead that came in seemed to dissolve into uncertainty. As days passed, the search grew more desperate. Flyers with Cindy's photo were distributed across nearby towns, and local newspapers covered the story extensively. Randall Kruger, Cindy's boyfriend, worked tirelessly with the search teams, refusing to give up hope. He retraced trails, spoke with rangers, and even organized his own small search groups when official efforts slowed down. Despite the efforts, the trail grew cold. The forest yielded no sign of her, no clothing, no belongings, not even footprints. It was as though the Great Smoky Mountains had swallowed her whole, leaving behind only questions. By the end of the summer, with no evidence and no breakthroughs, official search efforts were scaled back. Cindy's family and loved ones were left with heartbreak and a haunting void. For investigators, the case became one of Tennessee's enduring mysteries. A bright young woman had vanished in broad daylight in one of the most visited national parks in the country, and no one could explain how or why. 2 decades passed since Cindy Barrett had disappeared into the Smoky Mountains, and her case remained one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in Tennessee. For years, her family had lived in painful uncertainty, holding on to the fragile hope that she might one day walk back into their lives. But in the summer of 2010, the silence of the mountains was finally broken by a discovery that would send ripples of shock through everyone who had known her. In June of that year, a group of hikers ventured into a remote section of the park, far off the main trails and deep into rugged terrain rarely touched by visitors. They were following a faint game trail when one of them spotted something unusual, glinting beneath a blanket of moss and leaves. At first, they thought it was just old camping gear, abandoned long ago. But as they brushed away the soil, their hearts sank. It was the rusted frame of a woman's eyeglasses, and nearby, what appeared to be human bones. Park rangers were immediately called to the scene. The area was cordoned off, and forensic teams began the careful process of excavation. Within days, the remains were confirmed to be human. Lying alongside them were a few deteriorated personal items, a faded fabric backpack, scraps of clothing, and a library key tag that investigators instantly recognized it belonged to Cindy Barrett. After 20 years, her final resting place had been found. News of the discovery stunned the community. For Cindy's family, the confirmation brought a bittersweet wave of emotions. The unbearable limbo of not knowing was finally over, yet closure came with the painful reality of death. Her brother described it as a wound that finally scabbed over, but one that will never fully heal. The condition of the remains offered only limited answers. Forensic experts determined that Cindy had likely perished not long after her disappearance in 1990, but the exact cause of death remained elusive. There were no clear signs of foul play, no broken bones or trauma that could be linked to an attack. Some investigators leaned toward the possibility of an accident. Perhaps Cindy had strayed off the trail, lost her footing, and fallen into the hidden ravine where she was finally found. Others couldn't shake the sense that the case still carried unsettling questions. Why had search teams in 1990, with dogs and helicopters, failed to find her body in the same area? And why were her belongings scattered so strangely, almost as if they had been deliberately hidden? The discovery reignited public interest in Cindy's story. Newspapers revisited the case, and television stations covered the recovery of her remains with solemn detail. Old friends and co-workers came forward to share memories of the kind and gentle librarian who had touched so many lives. For Randall, her longtime boyfriend, the news reopened wounds he had tried to bury. He admitted that even after 2 decades, he had never stopped searching in his own quiet way. The Smoky Mountains, beautiful yet unforgiving, had finally given up their secret. But instead of delivering clear answers, the discovery only deepened the mystery surrounding Cindy Barrett's final moments. When Cindy Barrett's remains were recovered in 2010, investigators didn't just close the case and file it away. Instead, the discovery breathed new life into the investigation. For 2 decades, theories had swirled about what might have happened to the young librarian. Now, with her remains finally found, the spotlight returned not only to the Smoky Mountains, but also to the people closest to her, particularly her longtime boyfriend, Randall Kruger. From the very beginning back in 1990, Randall had been a central figure in Cindy's story. He had been the one to raise the alarm when she didn't come home, the one who tirelessly joined search teams, and the one who spoke to reporters about how much she meant to him. To many, his devotion seemed genuine, but to investigators, proximity often meant scrutiny. When someone vanishes under mysterious circumstances, those closest to the victim are almost always examined first. In 2010, after Cindy's remains were identified, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation quietly reopened files that had gathered dust for years. Detectives revisited witness statements, re-examined timelines, and tried to piece together whether Randall's account from 1990 had any gaps. Some details troubled them. Randall had told police he last saw Cindy at the cabin before she went for a short walk, but he hadn't reported her missing until several hours later. In that crucial window of time, no one could account for his exact whereabouts. Adding to the suspicion were long-standing whispers about the relationship between Randall and Cindy. Friends described it as loving, but also complicated. Cindy, by 1990, had been contemplating major changes in her life, possibly moving closer to her family, and even considering a new job out of state. Some quietly wondered if Randall feared losing her. Though no one could prove tension between them, investigators noted that personal conflicts are often the root of tragedies. However, there was still no hard evidence linking Randall to Cindy's disappearance. The remains provided little forensic clarity. No injuries could be definitively tied to foul play, and the decades that had passed had erased many potential clues. Still, investigators pressed Randall with renewed questions. He cooperated, agreeing to interviews and even offering DNA samples, hoping to clear his name once and for all. Public perception, however, was less forgiving. In the small Tennessee community, rumors spread quickly. To some, Randall was the heartbroken partner who had lost the love of his life. To others, he was a man who knew more than he let on, someone who had managed to live freely for 20 years while the woman he claimed to love lay hidden in the forest. Ultimately, despite the renewed scrutiny, no charges were ever filed. The case lingered in a gray space, half answered, half mystery. Randall lived under the shadow of suspicion, whether fair or not, and Cindy's family continued to grapple with the ache of never knowing the full truth. The reopened investigation highlighted the tragedy of Cindy Barrett's story. Even when her body was found, the questions surrounding her death remained painfully unresolved. As the investigation circled back to Randall Kruger, detectives felt a quiet but persistent pressure to push harder. The discovery of Cindy Barrett's remains in 2010 had reignited old suspicions, and the public wanted answers. For 2 decades, Randall had lived in the same small Tennessee community, working steady jobs, keeping mostly to himself. Outwardly, he lived an ordinary life, but behind closed doors, whispers never ceased. To many, he was either the grieving partner or the man who had gotten away with something dark. Investigators began what could only be described as a slow pursuit of Randall. They scrutinized his every movement from 1,990, re-examining travel records, phone logs, and interviews. They traced back old acquaintances who might reveal inconsistencies in his past statements. Some noted that Randall had seemed unusually calm in the days following Cindy's disappearance, a detail that unsettled detectives. Others recalled how in later years he rarely spoke of her, almost as if trying to bury a chapter that refused to be forgotten. The more investigators pressed, the more Randall felt the weight of suspicion. Friends described him as increasingly withdrawn. He avoided public gatherings, stopped answering reporters' calls, and became wary of strangers asking questions. For him, life became a constant balancing act, living under the cloud of unproven accusations while still trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. Authorities, meanwhile, pursued every possible avenue. They tested old pieces of evidence with modern forensic techniques, hoping for a breakthrough. The backpack found near Cindy's remains was examined fiber by fiber, and soil samples from the site were analyzed. Yet nothing tied directly to Randall. Without concrete evidence, law enforcement couldn't bring formal charges. Still, the pursuit continued, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly, keeping Randall on edge year after year. Local media amplified the chase. Documentaries and newspaper series revisited Cindy's story, often placing Randall at the center. Headlines hinted at secrets, while talk radio hosts debated whether justice had been overlooked. For the community, it became a story of obsession, a young woman's mysterious death, and the man who could never fully escape the shadow of it. Randall himself insisted on his innocence. In rare interviews, he spoke with a tone of exhaustion rather than anger. "I loved Cindy," he once told a reporter. "I wanted answers as much as anyone else, but somehow I became the villain in her story." Whether his words were a plea for understanding or a careful deflection remained a matter of interpretation. The pursuit of Randall stretched on, but it produced no resolution. He was neither exonerated nor convicted, trapped in a limbo where suspicion was as heavy a sentence as guilt. And for Cindy's family, the chase brought no comfort. They were left to watch as attention shifted from their lost daughter to the man she once loved, while the truth, whatever it was, remained buried deep within the Smoky Mountains. For years, the case of Cindy Barrett hovered in uncertainty, with Randall Kruger at its center. But in 2016, nearly 26 years after Cindy vanished, a development emerged that would change everything. It began not with a police raid or a forensic breakthrough, but with a letter. Randall, now in his late 50s, had lived a reclusive life under the shadow of suspicion. He was tired, weighed down by decades of unanswered questions and community whispers. That spring, his health began to decline after a sudden diagnosis of heart trouble. Perhaps sensing that time was no longer on his side, Randall sat down and wrote a letter addressed to Cindy's family. In it, he poured out truths he had never dared to speak aloud. The letter, delivered through his lawyer, contained a quiet but devastating confession. Randall admitted that on the night of Cindy's disappearance in 1990, the two of them had argued. Cindy had spoken about leaving Tennessee, about starting fresh in another state. Randall, terrified of losing her, had reacted with anger. The argument grew heated, and when Cindy stormed out into the night, Randall followed her. In his account, what happened next was not premeditated violence, but a tragic accident. He claimed Cindy slipped on the steep trail near the cabin and struck her head. Panicked, he said, he carried her into the woods, unable to face what had happened. Overcome by fear, he left her there and never found the courage to come forward. The confession was both shocking and strangely anticlimactic. There was no sinister plot, no elaborate cover-up, just a man who let fear dictate his choices and condemned Cindy's family to decades of torment. Investigators reviewed the letter and found that, while it matched certain details consistent with the location of Cindy's remains, there was no way to fully verify every word. Still, for the family, it provided something they had craved for 26 years, a version of the truth, however painful. Cindy's brother described the letter as a knife that cut deep, but also one that allowed us to finally close the wound. For Randall, it was the unburdening of a secret that had haunted him for half his life. Not long after the letter became public, his health declined further, and he passed away quietly, never facing trial, but leaving behind his final admission. The truth, at last, had surfaced, not the kind of justice many had hoped for, but an ending that revealed the frailty of human fear and the irreversible cost of silence. The confession letter should have brought peace, yet the truth often comes with its own shadows. For Cindy Barrett's family, Randall's words were a double-edged sword. On one hand, they finally knew what had happened in those mysterious hours in 1990. On the other, they were forced to face the devastating reality that Cindy's death had not been a mystery of nature or a stranger's crime, but the result of a moment of fear and weakness from the man she trusted most. Her brother said in an interview, "Closure doesn't mean the pain goes away. It means the questions stop, but the ache remains." For 20 years they had prayed for answers, and now those answers carried the bitter taste of betrayal. Randall's passing meant he would never stand before a judge, never face a jury, never be asked to fully account for his choices. Instead, his truth came in the form of ink on paper, a quiet admission written in the solitude of regret. The Great Smoky Mountains, where Cindy's life ended, became more than just a setting. It became a character in her story. Visitors who walk its trails today may never know that beneath the beauty lies a history marked by loss. Hikers often describe the park as serene, yet for those who remember Cindy, there is an undercurrent of sorrow in its silence, as though the trees themselves still hold fragments of her story. Cindy's friends and colleagues at the library never forgot her gentle presence. In the years after the confession, they created a small memorial corner inside the library where she once worked, a shelf of her favorite books, each marked with her name. To them, it was a way of ensuring her spirit lived on, not as the victim of a tragedy, but as the kind, thoughtful woman who had inspired readers and children alike. For the community, the case became a cautionary tale about silence. How many tragedies deepen because someone is too afraid to speak? How many families suffer needlessly because the truth is buried under fear and shame? Randall's letter was more than a confession. It was a stark reminder of the heavy price of secrets. In the end, Cindy Barrett's story is not only about a young woman's untimely death, but also about the fragility of trust and the destructive power of fear. She was a woman with dreams, plans, and kindness that touched everyone around her. Yet in a single night, all of that was lost, not by fate, but by human weakness. As we close this story, one truth remains clear. The past always waits to be uncovered. The Smoky Mountains held Cindy's body for 20 years before giving her back to the world. Randall held his secret for even longer, until his conscience forced it into the light. And now, both the silence of the forest and the silence of his guilt have been broken. Perhaps the lesson here is this: life is fragile, trust is sacred, and silence can be as deadly as violence itself. If Cindy's story teaches us anything, it is that we must speak, even when fear tempts us to stay quiet, because in the end, the truth always finds its way out of the shadows. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Last Seen for more haunting mysteries and untold disappearances. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think really happened to Cindy? Your voice keeps these stories alive, and together, we make sure they're never forgotten.